On Mount Kyllene in Arcadia, in a cave folded deep into the flank of the mountain, the newborn Hermes worked one hand loose from his swaddling and felt along the woven edge of his crib for the place where it ended. A few feet away his mother slept, worn out with the birth, and the fire had burned down to a red seam among the ashes. He was the son of Zeus and Maia the Pleiad, a god not a day old, and the heavens had not yet learned his name. Before the sun rose twice, he would be a thief, a musician, and a lyre praised aloud by his own father. And a question waits in the dark of that cave. How does a heap of roadside stones, to which each passing traveler adds one more, become the god who leads the dead across the last threshold? If these ancient stories help you rest, subscribe, so the next story can find you at bedtime. The answer is written in clay tablets that survived only because the palaces holding them burned, in stone pillars that stood oiled and wreathed outside the front doors of Athens, and in a hymn about a day-old thief that made Zeus laugh aloud in his own hall. It is written also in the habits of people who wrote nothing down at all, in the hush that falls on a crowded room for no reason anyone can name, in the last drops of wine tipped onto the floor as the lamps are put out, and wherever one world touches another in the hours ahead, at a cave mouth, at a doorway, at a fork in a track worn pale into a hillside, this god is already standing there before anyone arrives, waiting to see who comes and which way they turn. The cave of Kyllene was a deep and quiet dwelling, and the country around it lay as far from the courts of heaven as any land in Greece. Outside were remote hills and thin pastures, goat tracks and stony slopes, where shepherds counted their flocks by the last of the light, and settlements so small that a stranger on the road was an event to be talked over for a week. Inside, the air was cool and close, scented with wood smoke and with the herbs Maia kept hung from the rock above her, and the floor was swept stone, with a hollow worn smooth in it by long use. The child had come into the world in the grey hour before dawn, and by the time the sun stood high, he was already something more than an ordinary newborn, watchful where others would only sleep. He had lain swaddled in soft cloth, wrapped as any infant is wrapped, and for a while he had been content to look upward into the dark of the stone ceiling. Contentment was not his lasting nature. Even as an infant he was called polytropos, a word that means of many shifts, of many turnings, a mind that could not rest in a single place or a single shape. The cradle was the first thing the world had put around him, and he had lain inside it only a handful of hours before he wished to know what lay on the other side of it. So he was out and gone, the cloth left slack and still warm behind him, the woven bed holding the shallow shape of where he had been. There was no cry, no clamour, none of the noise by which a child announces its wants. He was silent, and the silence itself was a kind of skill. A newborn who could steal out of his own cradle without waking his sleeping mother was a newborn who understood, before he understood anything else, the value of moving unseen. In the years to come, men would call him the god of thieves and travelers and heralds, the bringer of good luck and the guardian of the road, and they would tell how he stole the cattle of his brother and crafted the first lyre from the shell of a tortoise before the day of his birth was done. All of that lay ahead of him, folded up small in the quiet of the cave. For now there was only the child, the empty cradle, and the low grey light at the far end of the stone, where the cave opened onto the wider world. Toward that light he went, whether he crawled or walked, or simply willed himself along the floor. The old hymn does not trouble to say, for a god of many turnings is not bound by the slow rules of a mortal infant. What matters is the crossing, the small, determined journey from the warm dark of the cradle to the cool mouth of the cave, and the moment when he came at last to stand upon its threshold and looked out. The sun had gone down behind the mountains. Evening was gathering over Arcadia, drawing the color slowly from the hills, and the outer world lay spread before him in the blue hour between day and night. There were roads down there, pale threads winding between the hamlets and the pastures. There were herds coming home, the soft clatter of hooves and the calls of herdsmen thinning into the distance. There was darkness rising up out of the valleys, like water filling a bowl, and there, at the edge of it all, stood the newborn god, 1 foot still within his mother's dwelling, and one gaze already fixed upon the open country, poised upon the line between the known and the unknown. This was his first threshold, and it would not be his last. A threshold is a place that belongs to neither side, a strip of ground that is at once inside and outside, ending and beginning. To stand upon one is to stand between two worlds and belong wholly to neither, and this, above all else, is what Hermes would become. He would be the one who crosses. He would carry the words of Zeus down from the bright heights of Olympus to the halls of mortal kings. He would walk the roads that no settled god would walk, guarding the traveler and the trader and the wanderer far from home. And in the end he would go down the last road of all, the descent that no living thing may take and return, and he would lead the souls of the dead across the boundary between the upper world and the lower. Every one of these journeys, the cattle and the lyre, the slaying of the watchful giant, the long guiding of the dead, begins at a doorway like the one where the infant now stands, looking out at the falling dusk. To understand how a child in a cave became such a crosser of worlds, one must go back further still, past the poets who first sang of him, into the oldest layers of memory, where his name lies half buried in clay. Long before Homer shaped his lines, long before the hymn to Hermes was ever sung to the sound of the lyre, there were scribes in the great palaces of the Bronze Age who knew this god and wrote his name down. At Pylos and at Thebes, in the age of the Mycenaeans, clerks pressed marks into tablets of wet clay in the script that we now call Linear B, keeping their careful accounts of offerings and of gods. Among those marks, again and again, appears a small cluster of signs that scholars read as Ima'a, the earliest form of the name, standing for the Mycenaean word Hermes. These tablets are the oldest trace of him that survives, older than any statue, older than any temple, older than any story told aloud that we can still recover. They were never meant to last. Clay tablets of that kind were working documents, records of who owed what, and which god was owed which portion, and they endured only because fire hardened them when the palaces that held them burned. So it is by accident, through the ruin of the very halls that kept them, that his name has come down to us from so deep a past. And what those accounts reveal is quietly telling. Wherever the name E-Ma-Er appears, it appears in company. It is written beside the names of goddesses, beside Potnia the mistress, beside Divya and Hera and Epimedea and others whose worship the scribes recorded, as though this god were rarely thought of alone. That pattern did not fade with the fall of the palaces. It endured for centuries, for the worship of Hermes almost always took place within the sanctuaries of goddesses, within the precincts of Hera and Demeter and Hecate and Despoina, a guest at their hearths rather than the master of his own. His cult was rooted in the remote regions of Greece, in the high and lonely places, among farmers and shepherds, and the small communities of the hills. This has led many to think that he began as a god of nature, a spirit of the wild pastures and the flocks, close to the earth and to the people who worked it. Such a god would have belonged to the herd and the hillside long before he belonged to the city, watching over the increase of the flocks and the fortune of the men who followed them, blessing the luck of the road and the safe return of whatever had strayed. The very sign of fertility that the later Hermes would carry in their carved stone remembers this older office, a power of quickening and of plenty bound up with the land itself. Of the belief behind it all, the tablets say nothing whatever. They record quantities and not devotion. So much oil, so much honey, set aside in his name beside the names of the goddesses, entered by a clerk who had no reason to explain to anyone what everyone around him already knew. From such a list one may learn that a god was owed something, and not a syllable about what he was thought to be. What the lists do establish is his age. He was already long established when those tablets were baked hard in the fire that destroyed the halls that kept them, older than the poems, a presence in the clay of a vanished age. There is another road back into his beginnings, humbler even than the clay, and it lies quite literally beside the road. In the earliest reckoning, the word Herma did not name a person at all. It named a thing, a plain pile of stones, heaped up beside a path in the open country. Such piles stood at the edges of fields and at the forks of the way, and they served a simple and sacred purpose. They marked boundaries. They marked the midway points between one village and the next, the halfway place on a journey, where a traveler might pause and take his bearings. And there was a custom that gathered around them, quiet and generous and very old. Each traveler who passed by would stoop, take up a single stone from the ground, and add it to the heap before going on. It is worth dwelling on what that means, and on how strange and beautiful it is. The marker was not built once and finished, it grew, stone by stone, hand by hand, made and remade by everyone who came along the road, so that it held within it the passage of countless journeys. No single person raised it. It was the work of all who travelled, a monument to the road itself and to the act of going. And the stone that each man added was not an ornament, but a small debt paid, an admission that he had come this far unharmed, that he hoped to go further, and that the going was not entirely his own doing. A man in haste still stooped for it. A man with his arms full still found a free finger to carry one more stone the last few paces. Whatever holiness such a heap possessed had not been conferred on it by any priest or king. It had been put there by use, a handful at a time, over generations, until the pile stood thick with the hopes of people whose names nobody troubled to keep. From this, most scholars have long believed the name of the god arose. Hermes, in this reading, is the stone heap made divine, the spirit of the boundary marker given a face and a voice, and at last a place among the immortals. It is a plain and satisfying account, and it fits the humble country origins that the old worship suggests. Yet it is not the only account, and the sharpest objection comes from the language itself. The scholar R.S.P. Beekes rejected this derivation and argued that the name comes instead from a source older than Greek, a pre-Greek root belonging to the peoples who lived in that land before the Greek speakers ever arrived. If he was right, then the word for the stone heap and the name of the god are not parent and child at all, but two survivals of a speech that has left almost nothing else behind it. Here the evidence gives out, and what has come down to us is the shape of the puzzle rather than its solution. A single word that means a heap of stones and also names a god, with no certain bridge laid down between the two. Whether the god drew his name from the wayside cairns, or the cairns and the god alike drew theirs from some forgotten tongue that both remembered, the boundary and the deity are knotted together at the root, too deep now for any hand to prise apart. Whatever the root of the name, the stones themselves did not vanish as the god rose. They changed their shape, and in changing, kept their meaning. The change comes into clearest view at Athens, in the 6th century before the Common Era, in the work of a man named Hipparchus, a son of the ruler Pisistratus. In his time, the old cairns that marked the roads and the midpoints between the village demes were replaced with something more worked and deliberate. In place of the loose heaps of stone, there rose pillars, square or rectangular, some of stone and some of bronze, set up along the ways and in the central gathering place of the city. Each pillar was crowned with the carved bust of a bearded Hermes, a mature and solemn man in the old manner, for in that age he was shown not as a smooth young athlete, but as an elder, grave and travel-worn. And from the plain shaft of the pillar, at the height of the body, there rose an erect phallus, a frank and ancient sign of fertility and of generative power. These pillars were called Hermes, and they carried the name and the office of the old stone heaps into the streets of the city. Yet they were more than road markers now. A herm was set outside the door of an Athenian house, standing guard at the very entrance of the home. It was a protector, a ward against harm, and a token of fruitfulness for the household within, and it bound each private dwelling to the shared gods of the community, so that no house stood wholly alone. Householders tended them as they tended a hearth, rubbing the stone with oil until it darkened and shone, hanging a wreath upon it at the festival days, setting down a little cake or a handful of figs at its base. The most primitive of all such images, the oldest Hermes of Mount Kyllene, where the god was born, had been simpler still, no more than a carved phallus rising from the earth, the barest sign of life and increase. From that stark beginning, the Hermes grew into the bearded, guardian pillars that watched over the doorways of Athens. And they came at last to stand where the graves were. By the 5th century before the Common Era, Hermes rose not only beside the doors of the living, but above the resting places of the dead, out along the roads that ran from the city gates, where the tombs of the Athenians lined the way on either hand. There they kept a different sort of watch, in among the carved stelae and the marble jars, with the ashes of the dead beneath them and the traffic of the living passing at their shoulders, and the mourners who came on the appointed days poured out wine and oil and honey at their feet before turning back toward the town. It is a fitting thing, and it closes a circle that had been opening since the cave. The stone that each traveler had once added to a wayside heap now stood at the head of the last road any traveler walks, and the same god who counted out the miles of an ordinary journey was left to count out that one. Yet a guardian of that road must first learn the roads of this one, and the child upon the threshold of the cave has not yet taken a single step into the dark. Beneath the roads he would come to rule, beneath the markets and the gymnasia and all the crowded offices that mortals later heaped upon him. There lies a single quiet role that seems older than the rest. It is the office of the psychopomp, the guide of souls, the one who leads the newly dead down from the world of light into the world below, and who alone may walk that road in both directions. Of all the things Hermes became, this may be the thing he was first. The scholars who trace his growth suspect that the messenger of the living gods began as a messenger between the living and the dead, and that everything else, the trade and the travel, the sailors and the herds, spread outward from this darker center like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. That inheritance looks stranger than it is, and the practice of his worship argues for it at every turn. His oldest recorded company is the company of goddesses whose business was the earth and what lies beneath it. His pillars, which began at the margins of ploughland, came to stand among the tombs outside the gates, with no more strain than they had stood at the doors of houses, as though both postings were the same posting. Mourners poured wine into the ground for him, where their dead were laid, addressing him there not as a herald of the sky, but as a keeper of what the ground has taken. And when the offices of heaven were at last parcelled out, he alone among the bright gods was given errands in the house of Hades, a duty none of the others sought, and none of them was fitted for. No single one of these things amounts to proof. All of them lean the same way, toward a god who had been traveling downward for a very long time before anyone thought to call him a messenger. And the greatest of all crossings, the one every mortal must someday make, is the crossing out of life. The god who stood at the edge of the field and the fork of the road stood also at the edge of breath itself, ready to take the cold hand of the newly dead and lead it gently down the long descent, past the pale asphodel, to the far shore from which the living do not return. There is a possibility, and it must be offered only as a possibility, that his most ancient nature was something the later Greeks half forgot. In the remote uplands where his worship first took root, among the shepherds and the farmers who kept the old ways, he may have begun as a figure of the sort other peoples called a shaman. Such a one was thought to travel in spirit where the body could not go, to pass through the veil that hangs between the seen and the unseen, to carry messages and divinations across it, to broker peace between the visible world and the powers that move behind it. If Hermes was ever such a mediator, then the winged errands of his later fame are only the daylight face of a far older darkness, and the god who ushers dreams to sleeping mortals is doing quietly what he has always done, moving between the two rooms of the world as easily as most souls move from one thought to the next. That older shape waits behind everything that follows, the guide upon the threshold, and the fuller story now gives him a mother and a father, and a cave with a name. The account most often told makes him the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and of Maia, one of the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas, the sisters the Greeks set among the stars as the Pleiades. Maia was the eldest and the shyest of the 7, a nymph who kept to herself in the shadowed hollows of a mountain rather than among the bright company of Olympus. In the deep cave of Kyllene, in the wild highlands of Arcadia, she bore her son away from the eyes of gods and men, and there, on that quiet floor of stone, the child first drew breath. The poets call him the youngest of the Olympians, and there is more in that title than the mere order of birth. It carries the memory of a god who came late to the celestial court, who was perhaps a latecomer to the pantheon itself, so that certain of the oldest tales still preserve the moment of his very first meeting with the deities of the sky. He is not born already seated at the high table. He must arrive there and win his place, and the winning is a story in itself. So the newborn of the mountain cave, wrapped and laid in his cradle by his gentle mother, is the same figure the whole long tale has circled toward. A small and swaddled thing, with the road of the dead already coiled somewhere in his nature, now set down within the divine family whose peace he is about to disturb. For he did not lie quiet. The great account of his infancy comes to us in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, one of that collection of songs shaped in the old measured verse and sung to the sound of the lyre at feasts and festivals and in the halls of kings. It is later than the great epics, given by most to the 7th century before the Common Era or thereabouts, and it is the longest and the most playful of the collection, a song with laughter running through it. In that hymn, the child is scarcely a day old when he climbs from his cradle and goes out into the world to test the reach of his own cunning. The singers heap titles upon him before he has done anything at all to earn them, calling him a bringer of dreams and a watcher in the night and a driver of oxen that are not his own. And on his first night of life, he sets out to prove every one of them true. What he seeks is the herd of his half-brother Apollo, the golden god of the far-shooting bow and of prophecy, whose sacred cattle grazed in the meadows of Pieria. A day-old infant should not be able to walk, let alone to drive away the cattle of a god, and yet the child does exactly this, and does it with an art that no full-grown thief could equal. He cuts the beasts out from the herd under the cover of darkness and drives them off across the land. And here his genius shows itself. He does not drive them forward as any herdsman would. He turns them and leads them backward, so that their hoofprints point the way they came and not the way they have gone, and any pursuer reading the tracks would be sent hunting in the wrong direction. Some tellings add that he bound coverings to their feet and fashioned strange sandals for his own from twigs of myrtle and tamarisk, so that the marks left in the dust told no honest tale at all. There he goes then, the small figure moving under the stars across the dark Arcadian country, the cattle lowing softly before him, their breath rising white in the cool night air, their backward-pointing feet stamping a riddle into the earth. There is no haste in him and no fear. He guides the great slow animals down through the shadowed valleys, with the calm mastery of one who was born to lead things along hidden roads. And indeed he was. This is his first errand, and though it is a theft, it is also a rehearsal. The god who will one day lead souls unerringly through the trackless dark is here learning his craft upon a herd of stolen cattle, laying down a path that no one else can follow and covering it behind him as he goes. Somewhere on that long return, with the cattle hidden away and the night still deep, the child comes upon a small living thing at the mouth of his cave, and from it he draws an invention that will outlast every herd of cattle in the world. It is a tortoise, moving slowly across the ground in the starlight, carrying its house upon its back. The infant god looks at it and sees not a creature, but an instrument waiting to be made. He takes up the tortoise, and from the hollow of its shell, the domed carapace cleaned and made ready, he fashions the first lyre that the world has known, the instrument the Greeks called the chelles, the tortoise lyre, named forever after the shell that gave it form. He fixes reeds and fits a bridge, and across the open hollow he stretches strings, and when he draws his fingers over them, there rises into the night a sound that has never been heard before. 7 strings he set upon it, so the singers say, and he tried them one after another, until the notes stood in their proper order beneath his hand. Then, having made the instrument, he made the first song as well, and what he sang of was himself, of Zeus and of Maya in the dark of the mountain, of their courting and of the child that came of it, praising his own begetting in the very cave where it had happened, while his mother slept on, and the stolen cattle stood hidden in the reeds. In that same wondrous infancy, the old tellers credit him with still more. They say he invented the foot race and the wrestling match, the contests of speed and of strength that would later be held sacred to him in the gymnasia and the games. So the child who steals and the child who makes are one and the same, and both are only aspects of a single restless nature that cannot leave the world exactly as it found it, but must always turn it, shift it, add to it some new thing that was not there before. Yet a theft is a theft, and Apollo was not a god to be robbed in silence. When the lord of the bright bow came at last to count his cattle and found the herd broken, he set out to trace the thief, and his anger was the anger of a mighty god wronged in his own possessions. The backward tracks confounded him for a time, as they were made to do, but Apollo was a seer as well as a hunter, and by omen and inquiry he followed the crooked trail at last to the cave of Kyllene and to the cradle where the infant lay, wrapped in his swaddling and feigning the deep and innocent sleep of the newborn. What followed was less a battle than a contest of words, and it is in that contest that the true nature of Hermes first shines out before the powers of heaven. Apollo accused, and the child denied, and the denials were marvels of their kind. How could a creature born only yesterday, a babe who knew nothing of cattle and could scarcely lift his own head, have crossed the countryside and driven off a herd of full-grown beasts? He spoke so sweetly and lied so smoothly, and wrapped his falsehood in such an air of wounded innocence that the sheer audacity of it was a thing to behold. Yet Apollo was not deceived, and the quarrel between the two sons of Zeus could be settled in only one place. The elder god took up the younger and carried him up from the mountains to the height of Olympus to lay the matter before their father and let the king of the gods himself judge between them. So the child came at last before the throne of Zeus, into the bright hall of the celestial court, held in the grip of the god he had robbed, and there he was called to answer for his deeds before the highest power there is. A lesser spirit might have trembled. Hermes did not. He stood, or was held, before the king of gods and men, and he went on with his cunning denials, spinning his innocence out before the assembled deities with such gravity and such boldness that the very impudence of it broke the tension of the hall. For Zeus, looking down upon this day-old son who would lie to his father's face with perfect composure, did not fall into wrath. He laughed. The king of the gods was so delighted by the wit and the daring of the child, by the antics and the artful denials of the youngest of his blood, that laughter filled the high hall of Olympus and rolled away the anger with it. And in that laughter the whole matter turned. Zeus bade the two brothers be reconciled, and Hermes, who understood better than anyone the value of the right gift given at the right moment, brought out the lyre he had made from the tortoise shell and set his fingers to the strings. The sound rose again, sweeter now in the halls of heaven than it had been in the dark of the cave, and Apollo, who loved music above almost all things, was caught and softened by it. The god of the bright bow, who had come in anger to reclaim his cattle, went away instead with the first lyre cradled in his arms, the instrument that would become his own chief emblem forever after. In exchange, the cattle were forgiven, and peace was made between the brothers, and the quarrel that had begun in theft ended in the giving of music. More than a peace was sealed in that exchange, for the terms of it made him a god with work to do. Apollo gave over into his keeping the herds and the flocks of the wide earth, the cattle and the sheep and the goats and the working mules, and set in his hand a golden wand of 3 branches, the staff of increase and of good fortune. He would not share the highest prophecy, for that was Apollo's own, and not his to give away, but the elder brother granted him a lesser and stranger sort of knowing, the divination of the 3 sister seers, who dwell beneath a fold of Parnassus, and speak truth when they have fed on honey. And Zeus, for his part, named him Herald of the Immortals, the one who would carry the word of heaven wherever it must go, and appointed him besides the sole messenger to Hades below, the only bright god with business in that house. So the spirit of the lonely hills, the Numen of cairns and cave mouths, whom shepherds had honored in remote places, was given his seat among the 12 and sent out to work, carrying into the court of heaven everything he had been in the wild country, the cunning and the invention, the love of the road, and the ease of the many-turning traveller who had led the backward-footed cattle through the dark. Thus the trickster took his place among the powers of the sky, and yet the oldest office still waited quietly within him, the guiding of souls along the road that has no return. Heaven had welcomed him, and the work of a herald of the gods now lay before him. The errands and the embassies, the messages carried between mortals and immortals on feet swift as the wind. But the god who could charm his own robbery into a gift, who could turn the wrath of Apollo into music and the frown of Zeus into laughter, would find that a court full of quarreling deities had need of exactly such gifts, and the tasks they set him would carry him far from the peaceful cave where his mother had laid him down. The errands began soon enough, but the first of them circled back to that very theft, for a robbery so bold could not pass through the world without leaving a witness behind. In the last dark hours before dawn, while the newborn walked the stolen cattle backward across the fields of Greece so that their tracks would tell a lie, one pair of mortal eyes had watched him from a hillside. An old herdsman named Battos kept his own flocks in that country, in the rich pastures near Pylos, where the grass grew high, and he was wakeful that night over his sheep, as herdsmen must sometimes be. He had seen the strange procession pass in the starlight, the cattle moving in a manner no honest drover would allow, and the small bright figure guiding them along the road. Hermes was cunning enough to know that a seen thing is only half a secret, and that the other half lies in the tongue of the one who saw. So he came to the old man where he stood, and he spoke to him gently, and he offered him a fine beast from the herd, if only he would hold his silence. "Say nothing," the god told him. "If any come asking after cattle along this road, you saw no cattle, you saw no drover, the stones themselves are your only company." And Battos, looking upon the reward, swore the oath readily. He pointed to a rough stone lying in the field, and declared that sooner would that stone find a voice and speak of what it had witnessed than he, Battos, would ever betray the trust laid upon him. So the bargain was struck upon the open ground, a promise given and a gift received, and the god went on his way with the herd. Yet Hermes was the god of the road and the boundary, the keeper of oaths sworn between strangers, and he understood the frailty of a promise better than any power in heaven. He did not travel far before he doubled back. He changed his form, putting off the look of the small drover and taking on the seeming of another man entirely, a traveler who knew nothing of the country. In this disguise he came again, in the first grey light of the morning, to the same hillside and the same old herdsman, and he asked after a herd of cattle that had passed that way, saying that they had been stolen, and that he would give a rich reward, an ox and a cow together, to any who could tell him where the beasts had gone. The old man did not hold. The doubled prize was more than his word could bear, and Battos, forgetting the very stone he had sworn by, told the stranger everything. Yes, he said, cattle had come along this road in the night, driven strangely, and here is the way they went, and here is what I saw of the one who led them. The words were scarcely out of his mouth before the traveller's shape fell away, and the god stood revealed before him, and Battos understood, too late, whose trust he had sold twice over on the same patch of ground. There was no thunder in what followed, no cry of rage. Hermes answered the betrayal with a quiet and fitting justice. The man had sworn by a stone that a stone would speak before he broke his word, and so the god made him into the very thing he had named. The old herdsman's limbs grew heavy and cold, his warm flesh hardening from the feet upward, his breath stilling in his chest, until where the living man had stood, there was only grey rock upon the hillside, silent, unmoving, keeping now in truth the secret it had failed to keep in life. So the telltale became a landmark, one more stone among the boundary stones of Greece, and travellers who passed it afterward may never have known that it had once had a tongue and a promise and a name. There is a severe justice in that story, and yet it belongs to the nature of the god who dealt it. Hermes stood over the crossings where strangers met, over the wayside heaps of stone that marked the edges of one man's land and the beginning of another's, and over the fragile bonds of hospitality and oath that let travellers move safely between them. To break faith upon the road, before the very god of the road, was to strike at the thing he most protected. The trickster who lied so gladly to his own father demanded honesty of the mortal he had trusted, and this is not a contradiction so much as the double face of one power, the god of cunning, who is also the guardian of the given word. From the roads of mortals, the god was soon called to a task set by the highest of all, a service that would earn him a title he would carry through all the ages after. In the house of heaven there was a quarrel, as there so often was, and at its centre stood the great goddess Hera and a mortal woman named Io, whom Zeus had loved. To hide the girl from his wife's jealous eyes, Zeus had changed her into a white heifer, a beautiful beast wandering the meadows. But Hera was not deceived. She claimed the heifer as her own and set over it a guardian against whom no ordinary escape could hope to succeed. That guardian was Argos, called Panoptes, the all-seeing, a giant whose whole body was set with eyes, 100 of them, some say, scattered across his frame. His watch could never wholly fail, for when he lay down to rest, he closed only a portion of his eyes at a time, and the rest kept their vigil, so that some part of him was always awake and looking out upon the world. Sleep, which comes to every mortal and softens even the vigilance of the wolf and the watchdog, could gain no full mastery over Argos. He tethered the white heifer and kept her under that unresting gaze, and no thief, however swift, could hope to slip past a watcher who never entirely slept. So Zeus turned to the son best suited to such a task, the many-turning one, the master of stealth and of the closed door and the quiet approach, and he sent Hermes down to free the heifer from her keeper. The god came to that country in the guise of a herdsman, driving a few goats before him, wearing the broad traveller's hat, and carrying no threat that the eyes of Argos could read. He drew near to the giant and fell into company with him, as one shepherd falls in with another, met upon the hills, and he began to play. In his hands was a set of reed pipes, and from them he drew a slow, sweet, wandering music, the kind of sound that fills an idle afternoon and asks nothing of the one who hears it. And as he played, he talked. Hermes was the god of speech as well as of silence, and he wove for Argos a long, low, unhurried tale, story following story, word laid gently upon word, the voice never rising, never breaking the drowsy spell of the pipes. The giant listened. It was pleasant, there upon the warm hillside, to hear such music and such talk, and one by one, slowly, the 100 eyes began to grow heavy. Where 2 might close, the god played on, and softened 2 more. The vigilance that no force could break was undone by patience and by sweetness, until the great watcher, who was never wholly asleep, sank, at last, into a sleep that took him whole, every eye shut, every light of that watching frame gone dark together. Then Hermes drew the harp, the curved sword, and he did what he had been sent to do, and the unsleeping guardian slept the sleep that has no waking. It was done with the detachment of a task completed rather than the fury of a battle, and when it was over, the white heifer was free. For this deed, the god was given a name that clung to him ever after, Argeiphontes, the slayer of Argos, a title spoken in the old hymns beside all his gentler epithets. And Hera, mourning her fallen servant, took the 100 eyes of Argos and set them into the tail of her favored bird, the peacock, where they shine still, a spread of watching eyes that see nothing, a memorial to the watcher whom sleep at last overcame. What that deed revealed was the plainest of his powers and the least discussed. He had not conquered Argos by strength, for many were stronger, but by his command of sleep itself, drawing it down eye by eye upon the one creature in the world built to resist it, The Greeks knew him for that gift and honored it in the smallest of their customs. When the lamps were low and the wine was nearly done and a household made ready for bed, the last libation of the evening was poured out to Hermes. A few drops tipped onto the floor for the god who brings sleep and sends the dreams that come with it. He was the one they thanked as the day closed, and the same soft hand that pressed the 100 eyes shut on that hillside would one day be laid on mortals at the end of their lives, so that the closing of an eye and the closing of a life were, in his keeping, done in much the same manner and with much the same gentleness. Because he was such a helper and such a knower of hidden roads, the gods sent him again and again to walk beside mortals who had set out on tasks too great for mortal strength alone. So it was when the young hero Perseus went out against the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze turned the living to stone, as surely as Hermes had turned Battos, a creature so terrible that no man could look upon her face and live. Perseus had been set an errand meant to destroy him, sent to fetch the head of a monster from the edge of the world, and he went with little more than his courage and the favor of the powers who chose to stand behind him. Hermes was chief among those powers. He came to the young man on the road, as he came to so many travelers, and he did not leave him to fumble toward his doom untaught. He gave him counsel first, the knowledge of where to go and whom to seek, the guidance that turns an impossible task into a series of steps a mortal can climb. He set him on the way to those who could arm him further, so that from the god's direction came the polished shield in which the hero might look at the Gorgon's reflection rather than her deadly face, and the winged sandals, and the cap that hid its wearer from sight, and the pouch to hold the severed head. And among the gifts of that company, Hermes lent his own weapon, the harp, the curved blade that had closed the 100 eyes upon the hillside. So a sword that had already done one divine work came down from Olympus a second time and hung, sharp and out of place, at a mortal's belt. So armed and so counseled, Perseus went on and did what he had been sent to do, and came away living from a task that should have killed him. The god did not fight the battle for him. That was not his office. His office was to arrive where a mortal's road forks toward death and make the other branch walkable, a direction given while there was still time to use it, a name to ask for, a borrowed edge, a warning spoken well before the door was reached. Hermes belonged to that company of gods who arm and counsel mortals at the edge of the impossible, the escort of heroes, the friend met upon the difficult road. And in the story of Perseus, he plays that part as clearly as anywhere, standing well back at the last, so that the glory would be the mortal's own and no one else's. Not all his dealings with the mortal world were errands of aid, and the old tellers set down the other kind with the same even voice. There was a princess named Chione, a mortal woman of surpassing beauty, and it happened that on a single night 2 gods desired her, and both were sons of Zeus. Apollo, the bright brother, waited for the cover of evening before he approached her, but Hermes did not wait, and he did not announce himself. He was the guardian of the darkness, and the guide of dreams, the one who moves unseen and unheard. And he came to her by his own swift and secret ways, touching her first with the sleep his wand could bring, and then approaching as no mortal suitor could. So the same woman was visited by both brothers in the turning of one night, each unknown to the other, the swift god and the bright god, drawn to a single mortal. Of that night came two sons, born together and unlike in everything. Apollo's child was Philemon, a singer, famous afterward for his voice and his skill upon the lyre, who was said to have taught choirs of maidens to sing at Delphi. The child of Hermes was Autolycus, and he was his father's son entirely, the greatest thief of his generation, a man who could handle any beast he stole until its markings changed under his hand, and its rightful owner swore before witnesses that he had never seen it, a man whose oaths were things of smoke. From him the line ran on, for his daughter Anticlea became the mother of Odysseus, so that the craftiest of all the Greeks at Troy carried the blood of the cattle thief of Cyllene in his veins. As for Chione herself, the old tellers give her a hard ending. Swollen with the honor of two gods, she boasted that her beauty went beyond the beauty of Artemis, and the huntress answered the boast with an arrow through the tongue that made it. Yet the crossings that the memory of the Greeks held most warmly were the ones in which the swift god came to a mortal in peril and left him safer than he found him. Of these, the most beloved is the meeting upon the island of Aiaia, where the witch Circe kept her hall among the beasts. Odysseus, homeward bound from a long war and driven far off his course, had landed there with his weary men, and Circe had already worked her cruel enchantment upon the first company he sent inland. With a cup of wine and a touch of her wand, she had turned them from men into swine, penning the grunting, weeping creatures who still remembered, behind their new shapes, that they had once walked upright. Odysseus, hearing of it, set out alone toward her house, to face her, with no plan but his own stubborn courage, and no defense against a magic that had already unmade his crew. On that path between the shore and the witch's hall, Hermes met him. The god came in the likeness of a young man in the first bloom of manhood, and he stopped the hero on the road and would not let him walk unwarned into the trap. He told him plainly what waited in the house, the drugged cup and the wand and the sty, and then he did what he so often did, which was to make the difference between ruin and survival small enough for a man to carry in one hand. He drew from the ground a herb, a plant with a black root and a flower white as milk, hard for mortal hands to pull, but easy for the gods. And he gave it to Odysseus and taught him its use. This herb would hold the witch's poison powerless in his blood, so that when she struck him with her wand and bade him go to the sty with the others, he would not change, but would stand unaltered before her, a man where she expected a beast. So the god instructed him in every step what to do when the spell failed, how to force from her the release of his comrades, how to bind her by an oath so that she could work him no further harm. Then, his counsel given and his gift bestowed, Hermes departed by his own swift road, back toward the high dwellings of the gods, leaving the mortal to walk the rest of the way alone. And it fell out exactly as the god had said. The herb held. The enchantment broke against it. The men were given back their shapes, and Odysseus passed through a danger that had swallowed his companions whole. What was handed over on that path was neither strength nor a weapon, only a plant with a black root and the words to use it. Yet with them, a man walked into a hall where the line between man and beast had been made to slip, and stood in the middle of that hall while the wand came down on him and kept his own shape. Even that line, it seems, the one that divides one kind of creature from another, was a border in his keeping. And there is another rescue the Greeks remembered, quieter than the meeting on the island of Aia, and set not upon a hero, but upon a whole town. In Boeotia, in the country of small walled cities and grazing hills, the people of Tanagra came to a season when plague pressed down upon them. The sickness moved through the narrow streets the way sickness does, taking the strong along with the weak, and they had no weapon against it, and no herb to hold its poison in the blood, as Odysseus had held the witch's poison in his. They could only wait behind their walls and count the dead, and it seemed that the counting would not stop until there was no one left to count. Into that fear the swift god came, not as slayer and not as thief, but as shepherd. Hermes took up a ram, a strong horned creature from the flocks he had always watched over, and he lifted it and carried it upon his shoulders, and he walked with it slowly around the circuit of the city walls. In some tellings, it was not a ram, but a calf that he bore, and the old memory wavers between the two, uncertain of the animal, yet certain of the act. Around the whole ring of the stones he carried the beast, tracing with his own steps the boundary between the town and the death that pressed against it. And where he passed, the sickness turned away. The plague that had entered so freely now found the way closed against it, as though the god had drawn a line the illness could not cross. The town lived, and the people did not forget how it had been saved. They bound the memory into a rite, and returned to it year upon year, so that the deliverance would not fade from the minds of their children. Each year they chose a boy, the most handsome boy of the town, and set upon his shoulders a lamb, and sent him walking about the city as the god had walked, carrying the creature around the whole circuit of the walls. Then the lamb was given up in sacrifice, offered against disease, and against drought, and against famine, against every hunger that could come upon a walled town in a hard season. The boy in his beauty stood in the place of the god, and the lamb upon his shoulders stood for the ram the god had borne, and the slow circling of the walls was the same slow circling by which the town had first been spared. From this, and from 100 quiet flocks upon 100 hills, came the image of Hermes that mortal hands loved most to carve. They called it Hermes Creophoros, the ram-bearer, the shepherd with a lamb laid across his shoulders, and its legs gathered gently in his hand. It was not the thief they shaped in that pose, and not the messenger with the wand of authority, but the herdsman who guards the helpless creature and carries it where it cannot walk. Figures of the ram-bearer were set up across the length of the Mediterranean, in many cities and many stones. So common was the tenderness of that image, and so widely felt. The shape outlived the worship, sacred art of later ages, in lands the old singers never knew, would set a shepherd with a rescued animal on his shoulders, at the very heart of its devotion. And whether anything passed from the older figure to the younger, no one can say for certain. It is offered only as a thing that some have seen and wondered at. The wand the god carries in so many of these carvings deserves its own telling, for it is his chief and best-known sign. The Greeks called it the caduceus, a herald's staff, and it was no plain rod. 2 snakes wound about it, twined together and facing one another, coiled as serpents coil when they mate, and above them the wand was sometimes crowned with a pair of wings and a small round sphere. It was a scepter and a sign of office, the mark that told all who saw it that the one who bore it came as a herald and could not be harmed. Hermes was not the only one to carry it. Iris, the rainbow, the messenger of Hera, bore the same winged wand as she ran her errands between the gods and the earth, so that the staff belonged to the whole calling of the messenger and not to one god alone. The powers folded into that wand are all of one kind, and they run in matched pairs. Each of them a door the god could open from either side. It could touch a waking mind and lay it down in sleep, and it could touch a sleeper and call the mind back to waking. It could grant a gentle death, loosening the soul without pain, and it could, in the older tellings, call a soul back from death to life again. And it could make peace between those who quarreled, laid between 2 angry men to still their dispute and bring them to agreement, as a herald steps between armies to speak the terms that end a war. Sleep and waking, death and life, war and peace. The wand touched both sides of each and passed between them. Among mortals that last power was the most visible, for the staff went where no other man could go. A herald carrying it walked out of a besieged city and into the camp of the enemy and back again, and no hand was raised against him, and what he had seen on the way was not held against him. The rod was worth more than an escort of soldiers, and the reason was simply that it was his. 2 staffs have been taken for one another so often down the centuries that the confusion now travels further than the fact, and the whole difference between them is a matter of counting. The caduceus of Hermes bears 2 snakes and wears its wings. There is a different rod, the rod of Asclepius, the god of healing, and it bears a single snake and has no wings at all. The one is the sign of the messenger and the guide of souls, the other the sign of the physician and the healer of bodies. And though later hands have sometimes traded the 2, the old distinction was clear. Nor was the twin snake staff first raised by Greek hands. A wand entwined by 2 serpents appears far earlier, among the Babylonians of Mesopotamia, many centuries before, and older still in the emblem of the Sumerian god Ningish-Zida, whose staff of 2 coiling snakes was carved when the cities of the 2 rivers were young. The sign that the Greeks gave to their swift god was already ancient when they gave it, an inheritance carried down the long roads of the east into the hand of Hermes. Upon his feet, the god wears the emblem nearly as famous as his wand. The Greeks called them the pedila, and the Romans the talaria, the sandals of the swift one, and the old poets tell a curious thing about them. They were woven, so the tellings say, of palm and of myrtle branches, plaited from the living wood, and yet the same poets describe them as golden, beautiful, and immortal, swift as the wind itself. Simple growing things and deathless gold at once. They carried the god over land and over sea faster than any mortal foot could follow, so that he might be sent from Olympus at one moment and stand upon a far shore the next. In the earliest shapes his people gave him, these sandals bore no wings at all. The wings came later, an ornament of the artists of after ages, who added them to show in stone and paint the speed the older singers had only spoken of. And sometimes those wings did not spring from the sandals, but straight from the god's own ankles, small feathered things beating at his heels as he ran. The sandals do not stand alone. About the figure of Hermes gather his other signs, each with its own quiet meaning. There is the rooster, the bird that cries at the edge of night and calls up the dawn, fitting for a god who guards the passage from dark to light. There is the tortoise, whose shell the newborn god had once hollowed into the first lyre, so that the small, slow creature became forever bound to the swiftest of the gods. There is the satchel or pouch he carries, the bag of the traveler and the trader, holding what a man bears with him upon the road. There is the petassos, the broad-brimmed hat that shades the eyes of the walker under a hot sky, plain in the old images and only later touched with wings of its own. And there is the cloak, spoken of in some tales, that could wrap its wearer in invisibility and let him pass unseen. One more way, the god slipped past what held other beings back. From all these signs and all these deeds, a single truth rises, which is the sheer breadth of what Hermes was asked to be. He began as the herald and the messenger, the voice of Zeus carried down to gods and men, and around that first office there gathered, in time, a whole crowded household of domains. He became the protector of travelers upon the road, and of thieves who work by the same darkness, and of merchants who carry their goods from city to city, and of orators who move an assembly with words. He was made the god of herds and of flocks, of roads and of trade, of hospitality between host and guest, of diplomacy between quarreling powers, and of the cunning, well-turned speech that wins its way where force would fail. So many callings met in one god that he seemed less a single figure than a crossroads where many roads of human life ran together. One of those callings the Greeks marked with a special name. They called him Logios, the speaker, the god of the spoken word and of the art of persuasion, and the sculptors gave this office its own stance. The Hermes of eloquence stands in the pose of a man about to speak, his weight settled, his hand lifted, his whole body shaped to the moment before speech, so that the statue itself seems to hold a silence waiting to be broken. And in this later art, the god had changed his form from the one the oldest shrines had known. Upon the archaic Hermes and the roadside markers, he had been a mature man, full-bearded, dressed as traveller and herald and shepherd. But the classical and the later ages preferred to show him young, a beardless athlete in the first strength of manhood, smooth-cheeked and lithe, the runner and the wrestler, rather than the grave bearded elder of the boundary stones. The same god wore both faces across the centuries, and the change of his face is a small record of how the Greeks themselves changed in what they wished their gods to be. When the power of Rome spread across those same lands, the swift god took a new name in a new tongue. To the Romans he became Mercury, and the name itself tells which of his many offices they prized. It comes from merx, their word for merchandise and for goods, the same root that gave them merchant and commerce, so that the Roman god of the swift feet was, before all else, the god of the trader and the marketplace and the moving of wares from hand to hand. And to the Etruscans, that older people of the Italian hills, he had a name of their own tongue, and they called him Termes. One figure, then, was known by many names across the ancient world: Hermes to the Greeks, Mercury to the Romans, Termes to the Etruscans, each people finding in him the face they most needed to see. The reaching went further still, past the shores of Greece and Italy, and toward the older riverlands of the south. And here the matter grew tangled, as such matters do. Herodotus, the traveller and gatherer of tales, was the first among the Greeks to look upon a great god of Egypt, the god honoured at the city the Greeks would name Hermopolis, and to declare that this was their own Hermes under another sky. Plutarch agreed with him, and Diodorus agreed, and so the identification passed into common belief. Yet not all consented. Plato, weighing the two, judged the gods unlike, not one being wearing two names, but two beings genuinely apart. And Cicero, sifting the old stories, counted not one Hermes, but several distinct deities who had all come to bear the name. Among them a son of the Nile, whose true name the Egyptians held too sacred to speak aloud, and another honoured in the Arcadian town of Phineus. Even among the learned, the god of boundaries would not sit still within a single boundary of his own. Out of this meeting of Greek and Egyptian, there grew in time a third figure, and it is important to hold him carefully apart from the Olympian of these tales. In the age when Greek kings ruled the land of the Nile, the Greeks joined their Hermes to the Egyptian Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, and worshipped the two as one in the old temple city that they now called Hermopolis. From that union rose the legend of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice greatest, named as the author of secret books of wisdom, a composite born of two traditions folded together. He is a later thing, and a separate thing, and though he wears the name of Hermes, he is not the swift young god of the winged sandals and the ram upon the shoulders. It is enough to note that he exists, and to set him gently aside, and to return to the older figure who is the true subject of these hours. For even the oldest figure the Greeks knew may not have been the first. The scholars who have bent their study upon him reach back past the Olympian toward roots that vanish into the dark before writing. One, named Frothingham, proposed that Hermes began far to the east as a snake god of Mesopotamia, kin to that same Ningish Zeta of the twin serpent staff, carried west along the trade roads until he found a Greek shape. Another line of thought, held by many and granted considerable weight, sees him rising from an old pastoral god of the hills, a god of shepherds and of boundary markers close in nature to Pan, whose herds and wild places he seems to share, and finds a distant cousin to this figure in the Vedic Pushan, the guide and guardian of travelers upon the roads of ancient India. Every one of these accounts is built upon resemblance, and resemblance is a weak sort of proof. Two gods may share a staff, or a flock, or an office upon the road, because the one descends from the other, or because both descend from something older than either, or simply because shepherds in every land have need of the same God, and will invent him twice, without ever having met. Nothing that now survives can tell us which of the three happened here. It is fitting, at the least, that the god who presided over every fork in the road should himself have come to Greece, by a fork that can no longer be retraced. And so the question that has walked beside this telling through all these hours may be set down gently at last and answered. How does a heap of stones by the side of a road become a god who sits among the immortals upon the heights? The answer is in the stooping. Every traveler who bent down, took up a stone, and laid it on the pile was performing a small, deliberate act at the exact moment of leaving one country and entering another, and performing it in the sight of whatever it is that attends such moments. 1,000 years of that, on every road in a mountainous land where nobody could get anywhere without leaving somewhere, does not leave a pile of stones alone for long. What gathered at the wayside was not really a marker, it was a conviction that passing over is a genuine act, that it can go well or badly, and that something is present when it happens. A power built on that cannot stay small, because what it attends is not confined to one field or one fork in a track. A boy crosses out of childhood in a single season. A trader crosses out of his own city into a market where he knows no one, and the scales are not his own. A suppliant crosses a doorway and becomes a guest, safe, where a moment earlier he was a stranger who might have been killed for it. A sleeper crosses out of the day, and at the last, a body cools on a bed, and whatever was in it is elsewhere. Hermes never climbed toward Olympus at all. The borders multiplied beneath him, and each new one was his by exactly the same right as the first. That growth shows itself most plainly in the small habits of ordinary people, which is where the truth of a god usually hides. A man walking a country road who stumbled on something valuable lying in the dust, a coin, a lost knife, a purse, did not call it luck. He called it a Hermaion, a gift of Hermes, and if a companion was with him, the companion would cry out, Koinos Hermes, Hermes is shared, and claim his half of the windfall on the spot. What the road gave up belonged to the god of the road, and through him to whoever was walking it. And in a crowded room, when the talk broke off all at once, and a strange hush fell over everyone at the same moment, the Greeks would say that a Hermes had passed through, as though the god had come in at one door and gone out at the other, and taken the noise with him. He was in the found coin, and in the sudden hush, in the doorpost gone dark under a householder's oiled hand. No temple was needed for any of it. He was simply present at every seam in the day. There was a scholar of the old religion, Walter Burkert, who looked upon this long journey from boundary stone to Olympian and confessed that he found it astounding that a mere monument of edges should rise so high as to take a seat among the great gods. He was right to be astounded. Nothing in a heap of field stones promises a throne, and no other god had so far to travel from what he began as to what he became. But the ascent was neither an accident nor a promotion. Nothing was added to the stone that was not in it from the beginning. A marker set at every place where one thing becomes another, and left standing there for 1,000 years while men walk past it and touch it and add to it, ends as no border at all, but a guide, not a wall, but a way through, not a stone, but someone who knows the road. So the many faces of him come, at the end, to a single face. The shepherd on the high pastures of Arcadia, with a lamb across his shoulders, the merchant in the crowded market, with his hand on the scales, the traveller footsore in the white dust, with his hat pushed back, the thief slipping between the houses at the hour when the lamps go out, and the guide who takes the newly dead by the wrist and starts down the long slope with them. They are one God, caught at 5 different doors. He is the moment of passing over, given a name and a pair of golden sandals, and set loose to run between all the worlds there are. Let the figures who have gathered through these hours be named once more before rest, so that they may settle quietly into memory as the light goes down. There was Maya, first of all, the shy one, the eldest of the 7 daughters of Atlas, whom men see as the Pleiades, dwelling apart in her deep cave upon the mountain, with her herbs hung above her on the rock. And there was mighty Zeus, who came to her in the dark, so that from that union the swift god was born in the grey hour before the day. There was the child himself, out of the cradle before the morning was old, leaving the swaddling cloth folded around nothing, and the hollow of his small weight still warm in the wool. There were the sacred cattle of Apollo, driven backward through the sand, so that their tracks pointed the wrong way, their breath rising white above the shadowed valleys. And there was the tortoise, met upon the threshold, whose patient shell became the first hollow body of the lyre, 7 strings tried one after another in the dark, until a theft could be turned into a peace between brothers. There was Battos the herdsman, wakeful over his sheep, who saw the strange procession pass in the starlight, and swore by a rough stone in the field that the stone would speak before he did, and who sold the secret twice on the same patch of ground, and who stiffened from the feet upward until he was only grey rock on a hillside, a silent marker that travellers afterward passed without ever knowing it had once had a name. There was hundred-eyed Argos, Argos Panoptes, whom Hera set over the white heifer that had once been a girl. Argos, who never let more than half his eyes fall shut at once, until a shepherd with reed pipes sat down beside him on the warm hillside and played and talked until the last light in that watching frame went out, and the tether was loosed, and the eyes themselves were carried away to be set in the tail of a bird. There was Perseus on the road to the world's edge, to whom the god lent the curved blade, the harp, along with the knowledge of whom to seek and in what order. There was Odysseus, halted on Circe's island, for whom the god drew up out of the ground a small herb with a black root and a milk-white flower, and taught him what to say when the wand came down and did not change him. And there was the ram lifted onto a young man's shoulders and carried slowly round the walls of Tanagra, year upon year, in memory of a plague that turned aside at a line drawn by a shepherd's patient feet. They can be let go now, one by one, the way a household puts its things away at the end of a day. On Kylene, the wind moves through the pines above the cave mouth and finds nothing inside but cool air and cold ash. The pale roads of Arcadia lie empty from one hill to the next, and the wayside heaps stand along them with no hand reaching down to add a stone. Somewhere, a fold gate has been shut and pegged, and the sheep inside settle against one another in the dark, and the last light has gone out of the high pastures. There is no errand anywhere in the world tonight that still needs running. One thing more remains, and it is the road itself. See it lying behind you in the dusk, the road of the Hermes and the crossroads and the wayside cairns, its dust cool now, the day's hoofprints and footprints holding their shapes with nobody left to read them. The far end of it dissolves where the last hills fold into the night, and its long curves soften one after another, so that the way you came can no longer be traced and need no longer be held. The messenger has carried his final word and delivered it. The flocks are folded, the markets are shuttered, the travelers have found their inns, and the god who guides them has hung his golden sandals by the door. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the realm of roads and thresholds, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the wanderer's journey in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.